Julian didn't return to claim his share of the inheritance. He came to reveal the blood-stained secret buried beneath the family home that was about to swallow us all. The smell of old paper and stale lilies always brings me back to that Tuesday. It's a scent that lingers in the back of your throat, heavy and cloying, the kind that reminds you of things that are gone and things that should have stayed buried. My father had been dead for exactly 10 days, and the house felt like a hollowed-out ribcage. Every footstep on the hardwood floor echoed a bit too long, as if the walls themselves were waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I sat at the heavy mahogany dining table, the same one where we used to have Sunday dinners before the silence took over our family. Across from me sat my sister Clara. Her eyes were rimmed with red, a permanent state for her since the hospice nurse had made that final, devastating call. Between us sat Mr. Henderson, our family's attorney, a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very same wood as the table. He was meticulously arranging a stack of documents, his fountain pen resting nearby like a loaded weapon. "We should begin," Mr. Henderson said softly, his voice gravelly. "I know this is difficult, but the estate needs to be settled according to your father's final wishes." "Wait," I said, my voice cracking. I looked at the empty chair at the end of the table. "We should try him one more time. Just once." Clara let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Why, Leo, we've called him 50 times. I sent him texts every day for 6 months while Dad was wasting away. I sent him a picture of Dad's hand in mine an hour before he took his last breath. He saw them. The Reed receipts are right there in blue." He chose not to answer. She was talking about Julian, our older brother, the one who had walked out 5 years ago after a blowout argument with our father that ended with a shattered vase and words that couldn't be unsaid. Since then, Julian had been a ghost. He didn't show up for birthdays, he didn't call on Christmas, and most importantly, he hadn't shown up when the cancer started eating our father from the inside out. I had spent my weekends driving back and forth from the city, and Clara had moved back into the house to be a full-time caregiver. We had done the heavy lifting. We had held the basin while Dad threw up, we had managed the morphine drips, and we had watched the light go out of his eyes. Julian had done nothing but stay silent. "He's still his son," I whispered, though my heart wasn't really in it. I was angry too, a cold, simmering rage that sat in my stomach like a stone. But I was also the one who always tried to keep the peace. "He's a stranger who shares our DNA," Clara snapped. "If he didn't care enough to say goodbye to a dying man, he shouldn't be here to pick over his bones. Mr. Henderson, please, let's just get this over with." Mr. Henderson sighed and adjusted his spectacles. "Under the terms of the will, the assets are to be divided. Your father was quite specific about the distribution, considering the circumstances of the last few years. The house, the liquidation of the family hardware business, and the offshore accounts." Just as he reached for the first staple, a sound cut through the funereal silence of the house. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the settling of old timber. It was the distinct crunching sound of gravel in the driveway. Clara and I froze. We weren't expecting anyone. The neighbors had already brought over their casseroles, and the funeral directors were done with us. I stood up, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. I walked to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain just an inch. A sleek black SUV, far more expensive than anything anyone in this neighborhood drove, was parked crookedly at the foot of the porch. The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was wearing a sharp charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than my car. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were a mirror image of my own, though hers were cold and calculated. "No way," Clara whispered, standing behind me. "He wouldn't dare." It was Julian. He looked different, older, harder, and polished in a way that felt like a slap in the face to our grief-stained clothes and tired faces. He didn't look like a man coming to mourn. He looked like a man arriving for a board meeting. We heard the heavy thud of the front door opening. He didn't knock. He still had his key. He walked down the hallway, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor, a sound that felt like a countdown. When he reached the arched entrance to the dining room, he stopped. He didn't look at the portrait of our father on the mantel. He didn't look at Clara's tear-stained face. He looked straight at the stack of papers in front of Mr. Henderson. "Am I late?" Julian asked, his voice smooth, devoid of any tremor or regret. "I assumed we were starting at 2. I see the vultures are already circling." Clara surged forward, her chair screeching against the floor. "Vultures? You have the audacity to walk in here now? After ignoring every single call? You weren't at the hospital, Julian. You weren't at the funeral. You didn't even send flowers." Julian finally looked at her, a small, patronizing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I was busy, Clara. Real life doesn't stop just because someone gets old. Besides, funerals are for the living, and frankly, I didn't think I'd be welcome. But business, well, business is a different story." "You're not getting a dime," Clara hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "Dad knew you abandoned us. He told me he was changing everything." Julian walked over to the table, ignoring her completely. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, our father's chair, and sat down with an air of casual authority. He looked at Mr. Henderson, who was watching the scene with an unreadable expression. "Is that right, Arthur?" Julian asked the lawyer, using his first name with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. Did my father successfully cut his eldest son out of the legacy he helped build? Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and looked down at the documents. "Your father did make several amendments to his will in the final months of his life, Julian. He was very clear about his intentions regarding the property and the business." Julian leaned back, crossing his legs. "I'm sure he was. But there's a small detail my father always seemed to forget, and I suspect he didn't mention it to either of you." I stepped forward, finally finding my voice. "What are you talking about? Just leave, Julian. We don't want you here. We don't need you." Julian reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, yellowed at the edges but kept in a pristine plastic sleeve. He slid it across the mahogany table toward Mr. Henderson, bypassing both me and Clara. "The assets you're about to split don't belong to the estate," Julian said, his eyes locking onto mine with a chilling intensity. "And if you read the fine print on that document, you'll realize that this house, the business, and everything in them, they haven't belonged to Dad for a very long time." Mr. Henderson took the parchment with trembling fingers. He adjusted his glasses, the plastic clicking against his forehead, and began to read. The silence in the room was no longer the heavy, stagnant air of mourning. It was charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Clara stood frozen, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. I could hear my own heart hammering, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. "This," Mr. Henderson's voice faltered. He looked up at Julian, then back at the paper. "This is a sale and leaseback agreement, dated 5 years ago, on the very day you left, Julian." "Exactly," Julian said, leaning back and resting his boots on the edge of the mahogany table. "The disrespect was a physical blow. Dad didn't tell you, did he? Of course not. His pride was always bigger than his bank account. That hardware business you think is so lucrative? It was underwater 5 years ago. He was weeks away from a public auction, a total loss of the family name. I stepped in. I bought the house, the warehouse, and the land for a sum that covered his debts and gave him enough to live on for the rest of his life." "You bought his life?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling with a cocktail of shock and disgust. "You didn't just help him? You made him sell his soul to you?" "I made a business investment, Clara," Julian retorted, his voice cutting through her emotion like a scalpel. "I paid the market value. In exchange, I gave him a life estate, the right to live here until he died. My only condition was that I stayed out of the daily mess of this family. I didn't want to hear about the leaks in the roof or the drama at the shop. I provided the safety net, and in return, I got the deed." "So, what you're saying," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth, "is that the house and the business aren't part of the estate at all. They're already yours." Julian smiled, and for a second, I saw the brother I used to play catch with in the backyard, except his eyes were dead. "Precisely, Leo. You're smarter than you look. The only things left in Dad's estate are the personal effects, the furniture, and whatever meager savings he had left in that offshore account Henderson mentioned. And considering the medical bills from his hospice care, I'd wager there isn't much left but the dust." Clara lunged across the table, her hand swinging for Julian's face. He didn't even flinch. He caught her wrist mid-air with a speed that spoke of a very different life than the one we knew he led. He held her there for a beat, his grip clearly painful, before dropping her arm like it was trash. "Don't," he warned, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm the only reason you two aren't being served with an eviction notice by a stranger this afternoon. I own this floor you're standing on. I own the chair you're sitting in. Technically, I own that locket around your neck if Dad bought it with the money I gave him." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Julian, while this document appears to be legally sound, your father did leave a final will and testament that addresses these assets. He was under the impression, or perhaps he hoped, that this agreement could be contested, or that you would waive your claim upon his passing in favor of a three-way split." "Hope is not a legal strategy, Arthur," Julian said, "and I have no intention of waiving anything. In fact, I'm here to expedite the process. I have a crew arriving on Monday to begin clearing out the house. I've already sold the land to a developer. The hardware store closes its doors for good on Friday." "You can't do that," I shouted, standing up. "The store has been in this family for 3 generations. People depend on us. Our employees have families." "Our employees?" Julian laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "They're my employees, Leo. Or they were. Now they're liabilities. The world doesn't need an independent hardware store in a town that's dying. It needs luxury condos and a strip mall. And I'm the one who's going to provide them." Clara was shaking now, not with sadness, but with a pure, unadulterated rage. "You're a monster. You stayed away while he suffered, waiting for the clock to run out so you could come back and bulldoze his life. You planned this, every single second of it." Julian finally stood up. He walked over to the sideboard where a bottle of Dad's favorite scotch sat. He poured himself a glass, swirled the amber liquid, and took a slow, deliberate sip. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the family photos, the heirlooms, the memories etched into every corner of the house. "You think this is about money?" Julian asked, looking back at us. "You think I need the few million this land will bring in? I have more money than Dad ever dreamed of. I didn't do this for the profit." "Then why?" I asked. "Why destroy everything he built? Why show up now just to twist the knife?" Julian set the glass down with a sharp clack. "Because Dad wasn't the man you think he was. You two were the favorites, the golden children. You got the bedtime stories and the college funds. I got the back of his hand and the weight of his failures. He sold me this house because he was terrified I'd tell the truth about where the startup capital for this family really came from." The room went cold. Even Mr. Henderson looked uneasy, shuffling his papers. "What are you talking about?" Clara asked, her voice small. Julian walked over to the fireplace. Above it hung a large, ornate mirror with a heavy gilded frame. It had been there as long as I could remember. It was a family relic, supposedly brought over from the old country. Julian reached behind the frame, his fingers searching for something. "Dad spent 40 years pretending to be a pillar of the community," Julian said, his back to us. "But pillars are usually hollow, and they're often built on top of things that were meant to be forgotten." With a sudden, forceful tug, Julian didn't just move the mirror, he triggered a mechanism. Part of the wood paneling beside the fireplace clicked and slid back an inch, revealing a dark, recessed cavity in the wall that none of us knew existed. "He thought he took the secret to his grave," Julian whispered, reaching into the darkness. He thought if he ignored my calls, he could die with his reputation intact, but he forgot that I was the one who helped him hide it 20 years ago. Julian pulled out a small metal lockbox, its surface covered in a fine layer of gray dust. He placed it on the table in front of us. He didn't have a key. Instead, he pulled a heavy brass paperweight from the table and smashed the lock with 3 violent, echoing blows. The lid creaked open. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't jewelry. It was a stack of old Polaroid photographs and a single blood-stained leather wallet that didn't belong to our father. Julian picked up the top photograph and turned it toward us. My breath hitched. It was a photo of our father, much younger, standing next to a man whose face had been violently crossed out with black ink. They were standing in front of the hardware store, but the store was burning. "This isn't the split you were expecting, is it?" Julian asked, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying sort of triumph. "But before we divide the assets, we have to talk about the bodies." Before I could process the word bodies, the front doorbell rang. Not the polite chime of a neighbor, but the heavy, authoritative pound of someone who wasn't going away. Julian didn't look surprised. He looked at the door, then back at us, and a slow, wicked grin spread across his face. "That'll be the police," Julian said calmly. "I called them from the driveway. I told them I found something you two were trying to hide." The pounding at the door wasn't just a sound. It was a physical vibration that rattled the fine china in the cabinet and seemed to shake the very foundations of my sanity. Julian didn't move. He stood there with that icy, triumphant smile, the blood-stained wallet lying on the table like a piece of carrion between us. "You're insane," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the relentless thudding from the hallway. "You called the police? On your own family? For something Dad did 20 years ago?" "I'm a law-abiding citizen, Clara," Julian said, his voice dripping with mock piety. "When I discovered evidence of a violent crime while inspecting my new property, I felt it was my civic duty. And besides, who's to say Dad did this alone? You two have been living here, haven't you? You've had 5 years to clean this place out. Why is this still here?" "Because we didn't know it existed," I shouted, my temper finally snapping. I took a step toward him, but the front door finally gave way. 2 officers burst into the dining room, their hands resting on their holsters. I recognized the man in the lead, Officer Miller. He'd been a friend of my father's for decades. They used to grab coffee at the hardware store every Friday morning. Seeing him here, in his uniform, looking at us with a mixture of confusion and professional detachment, made the floor feel like it was tilting. "What's going on here?" Miller asked, his eyes darting from the disheveled Clara to the polished, predatory Julian. "We got a call about a discovery of human remains and evidence of a cold case." Julian stepped forward, his demeanor instantly shifting to one of concerned, helpful cooperation. "Officer Miller, thank you for coming so quickly. I'm Julian, the eldest son. I was here to settle my father's affairs when I noticed a hidden compartment behind the mantel. My siblings seemed agitated when I approached it. When I opened it, I found this." He gestured to the metal box on the table. Miller walked over, pulling a pair of blue latex gloves from his pocket. He didn't look at us. He looked at the box. He picked up the wallet first. Using a pen, he flipped it open. A damp, yellow driver's license was tucked into the plastic sleeve. The face peering out from the card was young, with a wide, hopeful smile and thick, dark hair. "Elias Thorne," Miller whispered, the color draining from his face. The name hit the room like a grenade. Elias Thorne had been the town's biggest mystery. In the late 90s, he was a rising star in local politics, a man who had been vocally opposing the expansion of several industrial sites, including the land our hardware store sat on. One night, he walked out of a city council meeting and vanished into thin air. No body was ever found. No suspects were ever named. His disappearance had turned into a local ghost story used to frighten children about the woods at night. "That's impossible," Clara gasped, clutching the back of a chair for support. Dad liked Elias. They were friends. Friends don't usually keep a man's blood-soaked wallet behind a mirror, Clara, Julian said coldly. Miller was looking at the photographs now. His hands were shaking. He pulled out the one Julian had shown us, the burning store, and then several others. These weren't just photos of a fire, they were photos of a struggle. One showed a figure being dragged toward the back of the warehouse, their face obscured by shadows and smoke, but the clothes matched the description of what Elias Thorne had been wearing the night he disappeared. "Leo, Clara!" Miller said, his voice heavy with a sudden, terrible weight. "I need you both to step away from the table, now." "Officer, you can't think we had anything to do with this," I pleaded, holding my hands out. "We were kids when Elias went missing. I was 10. Clara was 12. "I'm not saying you did it," Miller said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the box again. "But this box isn't just full of old stuff. Look at the bottom." He moved a stack of old receipts and pulled out a small, modern plastic bag. Inside was a set of car keys, not the old-fashioned heavy metal ones from 20 years ago, but a sleek electronic key fob for a modern vehicle. And tied to the fob was a small hand-painted keychain of a golden retriever. I felt the air leave my lungs. I knew that keychain. I had bought it for Clara 3 years ago after her dog passed away. "Clara?" I turned to her, my heart freezing. She was staring at the keychain, her face a mask of pure terror. I lost those 2 years ago. I thought I dropped them in the park. I searched everywhere for them." 2 years ago? Julian interjected, his voice as sharp as a razor. "So you're saying your keys you supposedly lost, somehow found their way into a hidden compartment filled with evidence of a murder, a compartment that only someone living in this house would know about?" "I didn't put them there," she screamed. "You did! You must have found them and put them there to frame me." "How could I?" Julian asked calmly. "I haven't set foot in this house in 5 years. You and Leo changed the locks after the funeral? No, wait, you changed them years ago. I didn't even have a key until I used the emergency one hidden in the fake rock, the one you forgot to move." Miller looked at Clara, then at me. The trust that had existed between our families for decades was evaporating in real time. "I'm going to need you both to come down to the station for questioning, and I'm calling in a forensics team. If Elias Thorne is on this property, we're going to find him." "Wait," Mr. Henderson spoke up, his voice cracking. He had been so quiet I'd almost forgotten he was there. "Officer, there's something else. In the will, there was a codicil, a final instruction from the deceased that was only to be opened if Julian appeared." Julian's eyes flickered. For the first time, his composure wavered. "What are you talking about? I have the deed. The will is irrelevant to the property." "The will is irrelevant to the deed, yes," Henderson said, reaching into his briefcase with trembling hands. "But the codicil wasn't about property. It was a confession, and it mentions you specifically, Julian." Henderson pulled out a sealed blue envelope. He didn't hand it to Julian. He handed it to Officer Miller. Miller tore it open. As he read the contents, his jaw tightened. He looked up at Julian, then at the wall where the hidden compartment had been. "Julian," Miller said, his voice turning into something professional and lethal. "You told us you just arrived today. You said you hadn't been in this house in 5 years." "That's right," Julian said, his eyes darting toward the exit. "Then why?" Miller asked, holding up the letter. "Does your father's confession say that the only reason he kept this evidence was because you were the one who pulled the trigger, and he spent the last 20 years paying you off to keep you from finishing the job and killing the rest of the family?" Julian didn't hesitate. He didn't argue. He spun on his heel and bolted toward the kitchen, toward the back door that led to the woods. "Stop him!" Miller yelled, reaching for his radio. I moved without thinking, lunging across the table to grab Julian's jacket, but he was faster. He shoved me back, his strength surprising, and disappeared into the hallway. We heard the back door slam open and then a sound that made us all freeze. A high-pitched, mechanical whine, followed by a deafening metallic crunch from the backyard. We all ran to the window. In the middle of the overgrown lawn, the ground had given way. A massive sinkhole had opened up exactly where the old well used to be. But it wasn't just dirt down there. As the dust settled, we saw the glint of something metallic, a car, buried deep beneath the earth, its roof crushed by the weight of the soil. Julian was standing at the edge of the pit, staring down in horror. Not because he had almost fallen in, but because the collapse had revealed what was inside the car. In the driver's seat, perfectly preserved by the lack of oxygen in the buried tomb, was a figure. But it wasn't just a skeleton. And as the police flashlights hit the remains, I realized with a jolt of pure terror that the person in the car wasn't Elias Thorne. It was our mother, who we were told had died in a car accident in a different state 15 years ago, and she was clutching a handwritten note against the steering wheel that was still perfectly legible from where we stood. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sight of that car, the metallic blue sedan our mother had supposedly driven off a cliff in a neighboring state 15 years ago, resting at the bottom of our own backyard, was a nightmare made manifest. The mud and silt of a decade and a half hadn't completely obscured the jagged hole in the windshield or the way the steering wheel was bent at an unnatural angle. And there she was, or what remained of her. Julian looked like he was about to vomit. He backed away from the edge of the sinkhole, his hands clawing at his hair. "No," he choked out. "No, no, no. He told me she left. He told me he watched her drive away." Officer Miller didn't waste any time. He barked orders into his radio, calling for a recovery team, a coroner, and every available unit. He kept his service weapon drawn, though he wasn't pointing it at any of us specifically. He was pointing it at the situation, a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous than a simple inheritance dispute. "Nobody moves!" Miller shouted. "Leo, Clara, get back into the house. Julian, hands where I can see them. Now!" We didn't go back inside. We couldn't. We stood like statues on the porch, watching as Miller gingerly climbed down the side of the muddy pit. The soil was loose and treacherous, smelling of rot and ancient rain. He reached the car window and shone his high-powered tactical light inside. The beam cut through the gloom of the pit, illuminating the interior of the car. I saw the note again. It was tucked into our mother's skeletal fingers, protected by the steering wheel's shadow. It looked like a page torn from a ledger, the kind of ledger used at the hardware store. Miller didn't touch it yet. He was looking at something else. He reached out with a gloved hand and shifted a piece of debris near the passenger seat. He let out a sharp, jagged breath. "There's a second one," Miller whispered, his voice carrying up the walls of the pit like a ghost. "A second what?" I called out, my voice cracking. "A second body," Miller said, looking up at us. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. "A man in the passenger seat. He's wearing a city council pin." Elias Thorne. The two biggest mysteries in our town's history were sitting in a car 20 feet beneath our swing set. My mother and the man the town thought my father had murdered. But they were together. "He killed them both," Clara wailed, dropping to her knees on the grass. "Dad killed them both and made us live on top of them. All those years. The 4th of July parties, the gardening, the playing catch. We were standing on their grave." "I didn't know," Julian stammered, his bravado completely shattered. He was shaking violently now, the charcoal suit looking ridiculous against the backdrop of the muddy grave. "I swear to God, I didn't know about Mom. He told me Elias was a business accident. He told me he needed help hiding the evidence of a fire. I helped him move some crates. I thought it was just illegal inventory or insurance fraud. That's why he gave me the money to leave. He said if I stayed, I'd be an accessory to the store burning down. He never said anything about her." "Then why did he frame you in the confession?" I asked, stepping toward him. I didn't care about Miller's gun anymore. I didn't care about the police. If you were just a kid he was protecting, why would he leave a letter saying you were the killer? Because he wasn't protecting me, Julian screamed. He was blackmailing me. He made me sign papers I didn't understand. He made me touch things that had Elias's DNA on them. He spent 5 years making sure that if he ever went down, I'd go down with him. That's why I took the house. I thought if I owned the land, I could control the secret. I didn't know the secret was her. Mr. Henderson, who had remained strangely calm throughout the chaos, stepped forward. He wasn't looking at the pit. He was looking at the ledger page in the mother's hand. "The note," Henderson said softly. "Look at the writing." Miller reached in and carefully extracted the paper. He climbed back up the side of the pit, his boots slipping in the mud, until he stood on level ground. He didn't show it to Julian. He didn't show it to Clara. He walked straight to me. "It's not a confession," Miller said, his voice trembling. "And it's not from your father." He held the paper up. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the elegant, loopy script of our mother, the handwriting she used to sign our permission slips and birthday cards. The note didn't name a killer. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It was a list of dates, dollar amounts, and names. May 14th, $50,000. Arthur Henderson, June 2nd, $20,000, Thomas Miller. August 19th, $100,000, the estate of Julian. My heart stopped. I looked at Officer Miller, the man who had been my father's best friend, the man who was currently holding the only evidence of his own corruption. Miller's grip on his service weapon tightened. The help he had called for on the radio, the sirens we heard in the distance, weren't coming to solve a crime. They were coming to finish one. "I told your father this would happen," Miller whispered, his eyes turning cold and dead. "I told him the sinkhole was inevitable. The ground here is too soft for a vault that size, but he wouldn't listen. He wanted them close. He wanted to keep his assets where he could see them." "You knew?" Clara gasped. "You helped him." "I helped myself," Miller said. He looked at the sirens approaching the end of the driveway. 3 blacked-out cruisers, no markings. Not the local police. These were the private security the hardware business had been paying for years under the guise of loss prevention. Julian realized it a second before I did. He turned to run, but Mr. Henderson, the frail, elderly lawyer, reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, compact pistol with a practiced ease that suggested he'd done this before. "Nobody's leaving," Henderson said, his voice devoid of its previous tremor. "The assets are being split, just as your father intended. But he didn't mean the money, Julian. He meant the blame." Henderson looked at the approaching cars, then back at us. "You see, the hardware business wasn't just a store. It was a clearinghouse for every bribe, every payoff, and every dirty cent this town generated for 30 years. And now that the patriarch is dead, the board of directors has decided it's time to close the books." Miller pointed his gun at my chest. "I'm sorry, Leo. You were always the good kid. But you're the only one left who can sign the final transfer papers for the offshore accounts. Once you do that, we can finally put this family to rest." "And if I don't?" I asked, my voice steady despite the terror. Miller smiled, a thin, cruel line. "Then we don't need the sinkhole to be empty. We have plenty of room for 3 more. Just then, the lead black cruiser screeched to a halt in the driveway. The door opened and a man stepped out who looked exactly like the man in the photograph Julian had smashed earlier, the one with the face crossed out, the man who was supposed to be Elias Thorne. But he wasn't dead. He was older, scarred, and very much alive. He looked at the pit, then at Miller, and finally at us. "You're late, Arthur," the man said to the lawyer, "and you've made a mess. I told you I'd handle the children myself." He walked toward us, pulling a heavy silencer from his pocket and screwing it onto the barrel of his gun. But he didn't look at me or Clara. He looked at Julian. "Hello, son," the man said. "I see you finally found the car I bought for your mother." The man stood there, the silencer gleaming like a polished tooth in the dying afternoon light. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a king returning to a ruined castle. Julian didn't move, but a strange guttural sound escaped his throat, a mixture of a sob and a gasp. "Son," the man repeated, his voice like grinding stones. "I've been waiting a long time for you to finish what we started." "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice felt thin and fragile. The man ignored me, his eyes fixed solely on Julian. "The man you called father for 30 years was a thief, Julian. He stole my seat at the table. He stole my portion of the business, and he tried to steal the woman I loved. He thought he buried me that night at the store, just like he buried her." He gestured vaguely toward the pit. "But I don't die easy. I've been the one paying your tuition, Julian. I'm the one who gave you the capital for your investments in the city. I've been the architect of your entire life from the shadows." The pieces of the puzzle shifted and clicked into place with a terrifying finality. Our father hadn't been protecting Julian from a crime. He had been trying to buy his son's loyalty away from the man who had actually fathered him. The estate of Julian in the ledger wasn't a payoff. It was a running tab of a war for a boy's soul. Julian looked at the man, then at the pit where our mother lay, and then finally at Clara and me. The cold, arrogant mask he'd worn since he stepped out of the SUV finally shattered. He looked small. He looked like the brother who used to hide in my room when the shouting got too loud. "You told me she left," Julian whispered to the man. "You told me you'd find her and take me to her once the old man was dead." "I told you what you needed to hear to keep you focused," the man said, his eyes flicking to Miller and Henderson. "Now, Arthur, the ledger, and the boy. We need Leo's signature on the transfer. The offshore accounts are locked behind a 3-factor authentication, the patriarch's thumbprint, which we've already harvested, and the signatures of the 2 biological heirs. Since Julian is mine, he doesn't count. I need the golden boy and the girl." Miller stepped forward, his gun aimed at my temple. "You heard him, Leo. It's a simple digital signature. You do it, and you and Clara walk away. We'll tell the world Julian had a mental break, killed everyone, and fled. You two can go live your lives on a beach somewhere, far away from this rot." "You're going to kill Julian?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Julian is a loose end," the man, Silas, said coldly. "He served his purpose. He brought me back into the house. He opened the doors." Julian's face went pale. He looked at the man he had idolized as his secret benefactor, his true father, and saw nothing but a mirror of the monster who had raised us. He had spent 5 years running from one ghost only to be enslaved by another. "Leo," Julian said, his voice suddenly steady, "the hardware store, the basement. Do you remember the emergency shutoff for the gas line?" My mind raced. The hardware store wasn't just a business, it was a labyrinth. Dad had obsessed over safety, or so he said. He had installed a complex series of shutoffs and pressure valves that ran from the shop, under the lawn, and directly into the house's old furnace room. "I remember," I said, catching the desperate glint in Julian's eyes. "Sign the papers, Leo," Julian said, taking a step toward me. "Just give them what they want." As Julian moved, he intentionally bumped into Miller. It was a clumsy, obvious movement, and Miller reacted instinctively, shoving Julian back toward the edge of the sinkhole. In that split second of distraction, Julian didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the heavy brass paperweight still sitting on the dining table near the window. He didn't throw it at Miller. He threw it through the window of the basement bulkhead. Crack. "Sign it!" Silas roared, leveling his gun at Julian. But the sound of the glass breaking wasn't the only sound. From the basement, a low, hissing roar began. The sinkhole hadn't just exposed the car. It had shifted the foundation of the house, straining the old iron gas pipes. By breaking that window, Julian had changed the air pressure in the basement. "The house is going," I whispered. "Sign the damn papers!" Miller screamed, reaching for my arm. I didn't sign. I grabbed Clara's hand and screamed, "Run!" We didn't run toward the driveway. We ran toward the woods, toward the thickest part of the brush where the police cruisers couldn't follow. Bang! A shot rang out, chipping the wood of the porch railing next to my head. We didn't look back. We sprinted through the mud, the briars tearing at our clothes. Behind us, I heard shouting, the sound of more shots, and then a sound like the earth itself was inhaling. The explosion didn't just take the house. It was a chain reaction. The gas lines under the lawn, fed by the industrial-sized tanks at the hardware store a block away, ignited in a sequence of fire that turned the twilight into high noon. The ground where the SUV stood, where the sinkhole had opened, where Silas and Miller and Henderson were standing, erupted in a fountain of orange flame and black earth. The shockwave threw us forward, face first, into the wet leaves. I rolled over, gasping for air, and looked back. The house was gone. The hardware store was a skeleton of fire. The sinkhole had become a crater, a fiery maw that had swallowed the evidence, the killers, and the secrets of 30 years. "Julian!" Clara screamed. We watched as a lone figure stumbled out of the smoke. He was charred, his expensive suit hanging in rags, his face unrecognizable. It was Julian. He was clutching something to his chest, the metal lockbox. He collapsed a few feet from us, coughing up gray ash. He pushed the box toward me. "The ledger," he wheezed. "I got it. The real one. Not the one Henderson had, the one Mom was holding." I opened the box. Inside was the ledger page Miller had taken, but also a small thumb-sized drive Julian must have snatched from Silas during the scuffle. "It's all in there," Julian whispered. "Every name, every politician, every cent. The assets. The assets are the truth, Leo. That's the only split that matters." The sirens were real this time. Not the private security, but the state police, alerted by the massive explosion. As the blue and red lights began to dance through the trees, Julian looked at the burning remains of the family legacy. "He told me I was his," Julian said, staring at the fire. "But I'm not. I'm a murderer's son. Either way, the blood's the same." "No," I said, reaching out to take his hand. "The assets are split, Julian. The house is gone. The business is gone. The secrets are out." A month later, the news cycle finally stopped talking about our town. The hardware house horror, they called it. The bodies of our mother and Elias Thorne were given proper burials. Silas, Miller, and Henderson were never found. Presumed incinerated in the blast, their remains indistinguishable from the ash of the house. The offshore accounts were seized by the federal government, but a small portion, a legal insurance policy our mother had set up in our names before she died, was released to us. It wasn't millions. It was enough to start over. Clara moved to the coast, opening a small garden center far away from the smell of lilies and old paper. Julian disappeared. He didn't take a dime of the money. The last I heard, he was working as a deckhand on a freighter in the North Atlantic, chasing the horizon as if he could outrun his own shadow. As for me, I kept the ledger, not to blackmail anyone, but to remember. Every Sunday, I go to the empty lot where the house used to be. The grass is growing back now, a vibrant, stubborn green that hides the scars of the explosion. People ask me if I regret that Julian showed up that day, if I wish he'd stayed away and let us split the assets in peace. I look at the green grass, and I think of the car buried in the dark, and the secret our mother held for 15 years. I think of the brother who burned down his world just to save a family that didn't even want him. The assets weren't the house or the money. The assets were the three of us, finally standing in the light. I close the ledger and walk away. The silence of the lot is no longer heavy or cloying. It's just silence. And for the first time in my life, it's enough.